Last month, I mentioned on social media that I was going to talk about what a cult is. It's a really important topic for two reasons. One is that some people generalize and say that everything is a cult, which is just not true. Saying this camouflages some really evil stuff going on in the world. It's kind of a blanket moral relativism. And number two, there are some things that are indeed very culty, and defining it clearly would help people spot some problematic groups they might be involved in. There's like relationships and families that behave like cults. There are corporations and political parties that, when properly analyzed, are indistinguishable from cults. Okay, so what is a cult? I'm going to get to that. In the space of cult education and deprogramming, there are many people that have done incredible work in this field already. Members of ICSA, the International Cultic Studies Association, Janja Lalich, Rick Ross, and Steve Hassan with his very detailed and comprehensive bite model. I'm going to put links to all their work in the show notes, or if you're on YouTube, in the description below. I think that they're all very astute people, and what I'm going to present is not a challenge to their definitions and lists, but rather my particular view on cults and cult dynamics. Remember, I'm not a clinician or an academic, just someone who's been seriously deceived and figured some shit out. There are a few things that are important when going through lists like these. One of the things I see happening is that people who are actually in cults read these kinds of checklists and say, well, this doesn't really apply to me, only to other groups. It's really important to become a student of pattern recognition when looking at systems like these. You could discount a point by saying, well, we didn't pray, or we didn't meditate, or we didn't eye gaze, or we didn't wear white, or we didn't call them priests, or we didn't make offerings. Those are the specifics. We need to pull further back to see the generalities, the pattern. One group may call something meditation, another focusing, another sitting in presence, but they're not really that different, they're just different words. So why do people feel the need to argue that their thing or ritual is different from the others? I think it's because it's very hard for people to look at these lists and truly, without being emotionally vested, analyze their situation and say, yeah, I might be in a group like this. This thing I'm involved in might be an abusive relationship or might be a cult. It's critical to remain as open-minded as possible and be willing to question whatever situation you're in and see if there are matches to cult characteristics. It's also important to note that people who are in these coercive or cultic environments have resistance towards these lists. They will justify what they're doing and try to separate themselves from the pattern being exposed in the list. There's a curious thing that happens in the human brain. I know many people who stand for nonviolence and against coercion, and yet I see them being coercive towards other people. And then when questioned, they say things like, well, that's not coercion. This is for their own good or for the good of society at large. That saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? There's a rather common inability of people to recognize that the thing they say is bad is the thing they're actually part of. It's cognitive dissonance. To give you a clear and completely bizarre example of this blind spot, when I was still in NXIVM, one of the books Raniere recommended to a few of us was Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, a study of brainwashing in China by Robert J. Lifton. We were literally studying what he was doing to us, but we couldn't fathom the possibility. I highly recommend this book as it's a chilling study of what we're currently going through as a society. Lifton's research for the book began in 1953 with a series of interviews he did with American soldiers who had been held captive during the Korean War. In addition to these interviews, he interviewed 15 Chinese citizens who had fled their homeland after being subjected to indoctrination in Chinese universities. So from these interviews, Lifton identified the tactics used by Chinese communists to cause drastic shifts in opinion and personality, in essence to brainwash American soldiers. I'll get to my list in a moment, but it's worth mentioning that in his book, Lifton outlines the 8 criteria for thought reform. They are milieu control, mystical manipulation, demand for purity, confession, sacred science, loading the language, doctrine over person, and dispensing of existence. If this is of interest to you, do yourself a favor and study Lifton's work. It's as relevant today as it was when he wrote it. Okay, so what is a cult? We could try and narrow it down to a very simple definition. For example, Amy Morin, LCSW, says, "A cult is an organized group whose purpose is to dominate cult members through psychological manipulation and pressure strategies. Cults are usually headed by a powerful leader who isolates members from the rest of society." That's actually a pretty good high-level generalized definition. In my experience, a single short definition is useful, but what I'd like to do is get into the numerous characteristics that make up a cult. So I'm going to give you my list of cult characteristics and tactics. There are 25 of them.